Welcome. In this video, I'm going to show how to connect a Linux server to the internet on GNS3. Alright, so here we are on GNS3. My first step is I'm going to drag and drop the NAT cloud onto the topology. And then here it presents us with an option on where we're going to run it, and we're going to choose the GNS3 VM. The next step is we are going to drag and drop a Ethernet switch onto the topology. That I'm also going to run on the GNS3 VM. And then next I'm going to drag and drop this Ubuntu Docker guest that comes by default on GNS3. Now I'm going to create the links. Now I'm going to power on the Linux machine. I'm going to open up the console, and the next step is getting the Linux server and IP address, and we're going to do that with DHCP. So I'm going to put in this command here, which is nano etc network interfaces, which is where you change the network interface settings. And all I have to do is uncomment out these two commands down here. I'm going to hit Control X to save it. Yes. And in order to refresh the network settings, all I'm going to do is restart this Linux machine. And then I start it and open back up the console, and I can see that it did obtain an IP address. You can see there as well that it has an IP address. All right, and then to make sure that we are indeed connected to the internet, I'm going to ping public IP addresses. I can hit Google DNS. All right, so our Ubuntu Docker guest is connected to the internet. It's that easy. If you found this helpful, please consider liking and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next video.